Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you with us for what I hope will be an interesting discussion about Brexit and U.S. UK, Ireland UK relations. I think we're going to cover the waterfront. At the CSIS side, I'm going to be talking a little bit about trade with our guest, and Heather Conley, who is our director of the Europe program, is going to also have her side of the conversation and talking more about other issues other than trade. So I think we'll have a pretty broad discussion. And it's a real honor and pleasure to be able to introduce our guest, who's Ambassador Daniel Mulhall, the Ambassador of Ireland, the 18th Ambassador of Ireland, who has been here quite a while, it turns out, more than 3 years. So you're a veteran of America and a survivor. Ambassador Mulhall was born and raised in Waterford, a wonderful town, I must say. I've been there. It has a wonderful museum, which I hope is still open. I haven't been there for a while.
It is open.
It's a great view of basically Irish history all through the years. It's wonderful. Anyway, he's had a long and distinguished diplomatic career on behalf of his government, one which I'm sure is not over. But he has been, in addition to assignments back home in Dublin, he was Ireland's ambassador to Malaysia and concurrently accredited to Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. He was ambassador to Germany. He was also the Irish ambassador to the UK immediately before he came here. So he's had some of the most important positions in the Irish diplomatic service, I think. And we're very lucky to have him here representing his government. And so what we're going to do is ask the ambassador to make a few opening comments, and then he and Heather and I will have a conversation with him. And then we will turn to questions from all of you out there that are viewers. And we're on Zoom, so what you can do is either use the raise hands function or the chat function, and we will endeavor to call on you or read your question from the chat function. So with that, let me turn it over to the ambassador for some opening comments.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you. I'm glad that you enjoyed visiting my hometown of Waterford. It has some wonderful museums, and they've all been developed over the last dozen years or so by some very good people there. So I recommend everyone who goes to Ireland to go to Waterford. As my little sort of ad for my hometown, which I'm proud to be a free man, so I feel I have to do their business every now and then by promoting them a little bit. Anyway, just to say that I'll give you a few points that I want to make initially, and then we can have our discussion. And the first point I want to cover is the whole Brexit issue. Now, I was in Britain for the referendum in 2016, and it was a great shock to everyone, I think, that Britain voted to leave the European Union after 45 years of membership, which had, I think, been very successful for Britain. Indeed, the British economy had developed quite strongly during those years, and Ireland likewise had benefited greatly from EU membership. So there's no version of Brexit that suits Ireland. We would be happy if Britain decided at the last minute to swerve the car and do a U-turn and decide to remain in the European Union. But I recognize that is not going to happen. So what we're going to try and do is to mitigate the negative impact on Ireland of Britain's departure from the EU. And that negative impact comes in two packages. And the first package is the trade impact. Even though only about 10% of our exports now go to the UK, it's still a more important market for us than that figure would suggest, because for indigenous Irish companies, by which I mean small and medium-sized enterprises, the food sector, agriculture generally, Britain is a much more significant market, probably takes 30+% of the exports of Irish-owned companies, whereas, of course, when it comes to our global trade, which includes the trade of multinationals, particularly American companies based in Ireland, the UK's significance drops quite a bit. But for our own domestic Irish-owned businesses, our UK is a very important market. So we want to see a trade agreement between the UK and the European Union to regulate trade, to avoid tariffs, to minimize disruptions, to minimize the negative impact on Ireland's trade with the UK. And that may happen. I'm still, my fingers are crossed tightly. I'm still hoping that there will be a positive outcome to these negotiations that are currently going on. I'm encouraged by the fact that there isn't much noise coming out of the negotiations. And that means, the lack of noise normally means they're actually working. Whereas if people are out posturing publicly and making statements, grandstanding, it usually means things are not going too well. So I think there's a good chance that we'll see some kind of agreement. It'll probably be a skinny agreement. It won't be the full whack, but it'll be enough to tide over the relationship and to minimize the negative impact for Ireland of Britain's departure from the European Union. The second package of things that we worry about is to do with Northern Ireland. And here, it's not an economic worry because Northern Ireland is not significant economically for us, or indeed for Britain, but it is politically very significant for both countries and particularly for Ireland. And there, the problem is that when Britain leaves the European Union, legally, Northern Ireland will be a third country. It'll be part of the UK, which is not a member of the European Union, and we are a member. We will be a member of the European Union in the period ahead. So that raises the obvious question. Well, the border between the EU and the UK will no longer be, there'll be a border. And where will that border be? Well, there's a border, I suppose you could say, in the sea between England and France, but that's not going to be much of an issue because you can't have border. But obviously there will be disruptions in Dover and Calais and the Channel ports and so on both sides. But there'll also be another border, and that border is on the island of Ireland. And I think during the Brexit referendum in 2016, that border was kind of forgotten about. There was a kind of an assumption that, it'll be fine, nothing will happen, nothing will change. It turns out that border has become the sticking point between the UK and the European Union over the last 3 years of negotiations and remains a sticking point to a large degree. And the problem is that we don't want to see any border controls on the island of Ireland. And the British agree with that. And our European partners agree with it. So everyone's agreed, no border on the island of Ireland. But in order to achieve that outcome, you have to do something to monitor traffic on the Irish Sea between Britain and Northern Ireland, because otherwise the incentive would be there for a company in Britain to export stuff to Northern Ireland with no border controls of any kind. And then that stuff, those products go into the European Union through the open border in Ireland, thereby undermining the single market and creating problems for us and creating a demand from, for border controls to be introduced in order to prevent that kind of leakage of product into the single market, which doesn't obey the rules and doesn't pay the tariffs that apply in the single market. Last year, a solution was found to this problem, and the British agreed there would never be a border on the island of Ireland. A protocol was agreed between the UK and the European Union, and it basically says that no border on the island of Ireland, and there will have to be checks on goods on the Irish Sea to make sure that whatever is coming in to Northern Ireland that might be subject to a different tariff from the one that exists in the European Union, that will have to be looked at to see whether those tariffs should be paid because of the risk that those goods will end up in the European single market, or whether those goods are actually genuinely destined to be consumed in Northern Ireland, in which case the customs and the tariff issue doesn't arise. And the key point now at issue is, how do you decide which products are of interest to the European Union that might end up going into the European single market, and which products can you say confidently, no, they're going to be consumed in Northern Ireland? And I would say the bulk of products coming in from Britain to Northern Ireland will be consumer goods, foodstuffs, consumer goods to be consumed in Northern Ireland, and therefore of no relevance to the European single market. But there'll be a proportion of those goods coming in which will need to be checked and will need to be subjected to tariffs. And then if they are consumed in Northern Ireland, those tariffs can be returned to those who paid them. So that's where we stand. And unfortunately, about a month ago or more, the UK decided in its wisdom, for whatever reason, to pass a piece of legislation that would allow it to to override the provisions of the protocol on Northern Ireland. That has caused a major breach of trust, a major problem between the EU and the UK. But happily, we're now back talking again, and we're hopeful that those issues to do with Northern Ireland will be resolved. They're technical issues largely and should be capable of being resolved because the political decisions and the legal decisions have already been made in the protocol. And we hope that these issues can be ironed out, the wrinkles can be ironed out so that we can move on to implement the protocol fully. And hopefully there will also be an agreement between the UK and the European Union to govern trade between the two in the years and in the months and years ahead. That would be the outcome that we would prefer, that we would hope for. And I'm reasonably hopeful that it may be the arrangement that actually emerges from these talks. But there's always a risk that for political reasons the whole thing might fall apart. My final point has to do with the Irish economy and our connections with the United States. We have the most extraordinary connection with the United States. It's best illustrated by the fact that there are 700 US companies in Ireland, operating in Ireland, and that between them, they have invested $450 billion in our economy. So a huge investment. When you think about it, the Irish economy is about $200 and maybe $50 million. So they've invested like double our GDP in our economy. Now that's not last year, it's over a period of time. But the more extraordinary fact is that Irish companies have invested $150 billion in the economy here. And that Irish companies employ 110,000 people across the United States. So the relationship between the two countries has gone from one of extremely one-sided at one point when basically America was investing in Ireland and there was no investment from Ireland to America. But now it's a two-way flow of investment. Reflects the fact that our economy is more mature now and Irish companies have the wherewithal to be able to, and the desire to invest abroad. The United States is an important location for that investment. And then finally, our exports are balanced. Obviously, if you look only at one side of the ledger, which is the manufactured goods, then we have a whopping big surplus. That's because you have US pharmaceutical companies manufacturing blockbuster drugs for global consumption, for global distribution. And part of that production goes back to the United States, which means that our exports are boosted by the exports of a half a dozen US companies that are exporting large quantities of product, of pharmaceutical and medical devices to the United States from Ireland, because it's part of their global production is in Ireland, and part of that production ends up being exported back to the United States. But those companies also have major operations and employ vast numbers of people in the United States. The other final point I'd make is that a lot of the exports from Ireland to the US in the pharma sector are intermediary products, which means that they become part of a production process which is finished in the United States, and therefore a lot of the value added and the jobs would actually arise here in this country. But the final point is to say that during the pandemic, there's been no disruption to our trade with the United States. In fact, our exports have pretty much held up overall. In quarter two, they were down 0.5% over quarter one, which is remarkable when you consider the pandemic has intervened. But our export industries have not really been affected by the pandemic. Okay, they haven't grown as much as they would have grown in normal circumstances, but we've basically held on to our markets. And of course, in one area of pharmaceuticals and medical devices, our exports have increased dramatically because, of course, the pandemic has generated increased demand for products in that sector. So I will leave it at that, and I will face the music now for my two interrogators, my two inquisitors, the Grand Inquisitor and the other Grand Inquisitor.
Well, I appreciate your comments. You have done a really excellent job of describing the landscape and the current situation. And I have to say, for Americans that are not deeply immersed in it, it's complicated. And I commend you for making a complicated issue intelligible. Let's talk about the other alternative that you alluded to but didn't get into, which is supposing your optimism ends up being misplaced and there is no deal. And the deadline comes, UK walks away, there's no solution to the border problem, and there's no agreement at all. What would the impact then be on trade between Ireland and the UK?
Well, first of all, we hope that won't happen, but you're right, it's a possibility, so we have to face that.
We have to plan for it, I think.
We have to face it, and we are planning for it. Well, the lack of an agreement creates problems in three areas, I would say. The first is for Northern Ireland, which is a political problem, not an economic problem, by the way, because as I say, the trade is not that significant for us. It's more significant for Northern Ireland, but even there, it's not hugely significant. So the economic impact there would be limited enough, but the political impact could be quite corrosive. The second issue would be obviously our markets in the UK and would be affected because we would be having to pay tariffs. Our tariffs would be applied to a lot of Irish products that are going into the UK now and are tariff free at the moment. So that would be a big blow to Irish producers. Now, the question is whether there would be any other, like for example, we supply a lot of beef and dairy products to the UK market. Would they be able to acquire those products from other parts of the world? I don't know. It might be that those products are required, and even a tariff, while it would hit the consumer in Britain, it might not actually reduce trade as much as you might expect, but it would have some effect, and every effect will be difficult for us because we're going through, like everyone else, we're going through a whole set of economic challenges deriving from the COVID pandemic, and then the third. So it would be unwelcome, obviously, to have an additional set of burdens imposed on our economy because of Brexit. And then the third thing, of course, is transit, because 80% of all Irish goods go through Britain when they're going on to the European single market or to the European mainland. And of course, if you get all the ports jammed up with lorries having to go through processing that takes hours, and instead of, at the moment, a lorry goes through in a minute. Through the customs, through the border controls, and it could take hours for lorries to go through. So it could be a big backlog, and that means that Irish lorries coming from Ireland to on the way to France would normally go via the land bridge through Britain. Could be disrupted, and there the government is really strongly trying to encourage companies to use the direct route to France and there's capacity on that route. So I think you will find that more and more Irish companies will now start to use direct route to France to get their goods to the European market. And that'll be to the detriment, of course, of British ports, because the port of Holyhead, for example, is probably largely taken up with business from Ireland. So it'll be a big blow for them. Liverpool will also suffer a bit because of, if Irish suppliers start to use the direct route from Ireland to France. So on all those fronts, it's challenging. But what I would say is that on Northern Ireland, the protocol will apply either way, even if Britain leaves without a deal with the EU. The protocol will still apply, and Britain will still be obliged under international law to follow that protocol. But of course, if it refuses to do so, then you're in a sort of situation where you're into kind of uncharted territory there, because what would happen then to the border on the island of Ireland? It's been made clear, as you know, by senior members of Congress here, including the Speaker, that if a border is imposed on the island of Ireland on account of Brexit, that a U.S. UK trade deal will be blocked in Congress. And I think that's a factor in the minds of the British government. It ought to be, because the people that are making that point are serious with what they say. And in relation to our exports to Britain, obviously that's going to be a problem. I mean, if we have to pay, if there are tariffs on beef and butter and milk and all of these products that tend to have relatively high tariffs imposed on them, that will be a problem for us, and we will suffer a degree of economic pain. But and on top of the COVID crisis, that won't be good. But all I would say is that overall, our economy is far less dependent now in 2020 than it was on Britain than it was in 1970, when we were practically 2/3 of our exports went to Britain. Now it's about overall 10%, but for our Irish owned companies, it's more like 30%. And that will come down. That will keep coming down. That will be one of the effects of Brexit, by the way, will be to have Ireland double down on our relationship with our European neighbours, and to some degree, the relationship with Britain will suffer. Though we will be making every effort to avoid that relationship going into reverse gear, undoubtedly, we will see a bigger push on Ireland's behalf to try and support Irish companies as they diversify their markets away from the UK towards the European Union.
That was actually that was an interesting question I was going to get to. If we have, let's pursue the no deal, drill down a little bit, and then I want to turn it over to Heather. obviously, if there isn't any deal, you're going to have a bunch of issues that your government's going to have to address. Customs, immigration, cross-border services, qualification standards, things like that. Are there certain areas that where you think your government is less prepared than others, and where more work needs to be done to get ready?
Well, I mean, I can tell you now that I have been pleasantly astonished by the effort that's gone in Ireland to preparing for Brexit. I mean, it's been a huge kind of all of government effort. I remember before I left Germany, being asked by a senior German person, well, have you got contingencies worked out for Brexit? And I went, well, I'm sure we have, but I thought we didn't. Actually, when I got back, I realized that we really were working hard on preparing for this day, which will now come at the end of the year. So I think we're as prepared as we can be. A huge effort's gone into it. It's been unprecedented in my experience, at least. I'm 40 years plus in our foreign service, and I've never seen a project that has attracted such concentrated and sustained attention as the Brexit process. So I think it won't be smooth sailing, by the way, but I think we've done as much as we can do. Customs, I don't believe, will be too much of a problem. I mean, obviously it'll be a burden because, you know, stuff coming in from Britain will be subject to customs checks and tariffs and so on. And likewise, Irish goods going into Britain will have to go through the same process. So it'll be burdensome for companies concerned, and it may result in a reduction in trade or in a diversion of trade towards the European Union, but I think it can be managed. Immigration is not really a problem, believe it or not, because we have a common travel area with the UK, which has existed since basically the foundation of our state 100 years ago. And the British have decided over the decades that they would treat Irish people differently from everyone else, and that we would have complete access to live and work in Britain, to receive social welfare, to get healthcare, to be educated. We have, broadly speaking, the same rights as British citizens have. And the same is true. We've started to give the same rights to British people in Ireland on a reciprocal basis. So, and for example, Irish people can vote in British elections, and British people can vote in our elections. So, you know, it's all on the basis of residence. So that issue, and the EU agreed that we could continue this set of arrangements, even though Britain will be discriminating against other European citizens and not against Ireland. But the EU accepted this was a kind of historical thing and that there wouldn't be a problem with it. So there is an agreement now to continue having this extraordinary movement of people arrangement, whereby people can just get up and move to Britain, get a job, get healthcare, vote in the election, get social welfare if they require it, and British people come to Ireland to do the same thing. So that won't change at all, which means immigration is not an issue. But of course, remember, there'll be all sorts of other issues. I mean, things like open skies, you know. I mean, how's that going to work? I mean, we'll have to have some kind of, you're not going to stop flights between Britain and the European Union, but, you know, the regulations that cover those are not going to be in place any longer. So some kind of arrangement will have to be made. So there's a whole raft of things that need to be done between the UK and the European Union, which haven't been negotiated at this stage because the negotiations have all been concentrated on a free trade agreement. But there's also some ancillary stuff, which, you know, I think will have to be done on the basis of we keep the existing arrangements in place until we find an alternative. But they will have no legal basis because they're based, a lot of them are based in European law, and European law won't apply to Britain any longer.
I want to get back to, among other things, the U.S.-UK relationship as well and how it affects all of you. But let's go to Heather now.
Well, Bill, Ambassador, thanks so much. It's great to be with you. Ambassador, what I'd like to do is drill down a little bit more on the withdrawal agreement and the protocol on Northern Ireland, and then, of course, the internal market bill. Let me start back with an amazing amount of Irish diplomacy convinced one Boris Johnson to sign on to that withdrawal agreement and that protocol in Northern Ireland, a deal that his predecessor, Theresa May, said no UK Prime Minister would ever agree to because it treated Northern Ireland differently. While, of course, Northern Ireland is within the UK single market customs union, it's also within the EU customs union. And then we got this amazing surprise that the internal market bill would override that withdrawal agreement. And the European Union made an enormous push to say that internal market bill cannot stand. Well, it's still standing. Parliament, Westminster hasn't proceeded to invoke it or to rule on it. Can the internal market bill still stand and the UK and the EU can proceed with the free trade agreement? Do you have confidence in the joint committee between the EU and the UK that they can manage through this? Because it seems to me that as long as that internal market bill exists, you will never have complete confidence that the withdrawal agreement and the protocol in Northern Ireland will be implemented. And I'd welcome your thoughts on that. And then I have one or two more questions on Northern Ireland. We'll get to.
The withdrawal agreement was a shock to everyone. I mean, we had, at that stage, the negotiations on the Northern Ireland Protocol were going quite well, and the period, because it's really a technical thing of deciding which products you look at, and that's a thing you can do in a committee, and you can reach a compromise, and you find a list of products that both sides say, yeah, okay, those should be looked at, they should be subjected to customs and other checks. And this thing came out of the blue, it was a bolt from the blue, that this Northern Ireland thing, Northern Ireland protocol was being threatened by this internal market bill. And that definitely slowed down the negotiations. It probably put them into a bit of cold storage for a while, but they're back up and running again now, and both sides seem to have decided we can set the IM bill aside and we'll look at try to get an agreement, and then we'd have to look at what the internal market bill might mean for that agreement. So, I mean, my own view is that if we get an agreement, the internal market bill, I'm sure, can be nuanced, can be dealt with in some way by the British government that will remove the kind of threat to the Good Friday Agreement, sorry, to the withdrawal agreement and the threat to the Northern Ireland Protocol. But again, that's all up in the air because we don't know yet whether it's going to be possible to reach agreement between the two sides on, in particular, the free trade agreement between the two sides, because that would definitely remove the need for a lot of the things that are offensive in the internal market bill from a point of view of the European Union and of Ireland. So I'm hopeful that we will reach a point where the bill won't be a permanent thorn in the side of the relationship, but would be something that would be sidelined and would become to some degree irrelevant because it'll be overtaken by events.
Well, in many ways, this really did focus the attention on that protocol and the importance of Northern Ireland to the entire process. And we've certainly seen a bit of reinvigoration from the U.S. side with Mick Mulvaney's appointment as special envoy. He recently traveled to Belfast, to Dublin, to London to understand more. Help us understand how U.S. diplomacy is re-engaging in this issue. And I may be stealing a little of Bill's thunder, but in some ways, Speaker Pelosi and many senior voices in Congress have in some ways given Dublin a bit of a veto over a future U.S.-UK trade agreement, because if it in any way is in violation, it appears to me that Congress is saying no. Do you feel that sense that you need to sort of give the thumbs up if you would want a U.S.-UK free trade agreement to come to fruition?
Look, I would never put it that way. I mean, that would be overstating it hugely, but you're entitled to do that. You're asking me questions, and you're well entitled to ask me questions that slightly inflate, that more than slightly inflate how I would assess the situation. The way I would see it is that first of all, we want the UK to get a trade agreement with the US, because in the post-Brexit future, which is coming up now in a few months' time, we want the UK to prosper. Because if the UK prospers, we prosper because we have an important economic relationship with them. So our self-interest, we don't want to see the UK kind of reduced in economic terms because it can't get a trade deal with the US, and because it it won't have the same trading relationship with the EU. So that's the first point. The second point is that you have to understand the American involvement in this issue in historical terms, right? I mean, if you go back to the Kennedy era, for example, the State Department had a position of, say nothing about Northern Ireland because it will just hurt the special relationship and so on. But that position changed over time. I mean, Kennedy, when he was in Ireland, never mentioned Northern Ireland, as far as I know, in any of his speeches, never made a reference at all, because he was warned that it would be bad to refer to it because it would annoy the British and so on. And he went with that, even though he was an Irish American. But the key thing that happened was that people like Speaker Tip O'Neill in his day, who convinced Ronald Reagan to take an interest in Northern Ireland, people like Senator Ted Kennedy, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Governor Carey of New York. These people started to kind of build up a head of steam, and eventually persuaded the US government that it should take an interest in Northern Ireland, and that it shouldn't be held back by the British having a view that they shouldn't get involved. And that culminated in George Mitchell's appointment as the special envoy, and therefore in the end he ended up as the chairman of the talks, and he labored there for years, and eventually reached the agreement. And the US has always been a facilitator. I can remember in those days in Belfast, late at night, the word would go around. We'd be getting weary of these talks going on and on and on and on and on. And the word would come in that the White House is on the line. Bill Clinton was on the line, ringing people. Remember, this is the most powerful man in the world, who was telephoning people who represented 1.5 million people in a little sliver of land on the edge of Europe. And yet the most powerful man in the world was on the phone, urging these people to make the necessary compromises to reach agreements. And he was speaking to both sides, by the way. So that's the background to it. So I find a lot of Americans they feel that the Good Friday Agreement is something that they helped to bring about, and they did. And therefore they don't want to see it damaged. And that's why you have so many members of Congress now who are determined that they will not allow the peace process to be damaged by the consequences of Brexit. And that's why the British have been warned by powerful people in Congress, including the Speaker, that if they were to do that, there would be problems with the free trade agreement between the UK and the US. That's not something that, this is not my doing. This is the doing of American politicians. Of course, we're happy to see that we have support from people in Congress and in the administration. And the fact that Mick Mulvaney went to Ireland and to Britain recently was good, because he carried a message as well, saying, look, I think his view would be, if I remember correctly from what he said publicly, was that the US takes no side in relation to the UK and the EU and so on, but we're committed to the peace process in Northern Ireland, and we don't want to see anything happening that will damage that peace process. And he just made the point, I think, publicly, look, whatever I think, he said, it's a reality that there'll be a blockage in Congress to any trade deal between the UK and the US if the consequences of Brexit have been a hard border on the island of Ireland. So there's a reality there that I think can't be avoided, and I believe the British understand that, and I think it's part of the reason why I believe the agreement was reached last year, and it's part of the reason why I hope that the agreement will be reached this year to actually implement that withdrawal agreement properly, to implement the protocol properly, and to do a trade deal between the UK and the European Union.
Intrigued that I think your history of the Good Friday Agreement was very useful. I noticed, I think everybody, or just about everybody you referred to, had Irish roots.
Yes.
And that for a long time, I think our politics with respect to Ireland was driven by politicians whose ancestors came from Ireland. Yeah. Nancy Pelosi is not Irish.
Although she has 2 Irish grandchildren.
Well, that explains
everything.
everything.
Was married to an Irish American, and the family have visited Ireland a lot, so she's very proud of the fact she has 2 Irish grandchildren. Well,
that ruins my hypothesis. My hypothesis was that one of the things that your story about Bill Clinton, I think one of the things that happened through the process of helping bring that agreement to a successful conclusion was that I think larger segments of the American political leadership got invested in the issue. And it's not simply a question of Irish American politicians being interested in Ireland. It's a question of everybody being interested in Ireland. And I think the agreement's is regarded as a success story, and one that's important to protect. So I just add that note. Let's. I want to let's.
I mean, just on speaking of Pelosi, may I just say that I remember recently I was talking to her about the late John Hume, who was a great figure here, a great figure in the Irish peace process. He was one of the people that came up with the ideas that eventually ended up in the Good Friday Agreement. But the speaker told me that she had met John Hume, very early on in her. She'd just been elected to Congress when she met him. He was visiting San Francisco, and she met him, and she's been in contact with him ever since. So I think even though she doesn't have an Irish background in the way that, say, Richie Neal would have, or Ted Kennedy had, or others like that, she seemed to have had an interest in the subject going back to the early days of her time in Congress, because she met some of the personalities involved and she became interested in it. And when I was in Dublin with her there last year, I was intrigued to know that she was a friend of Bono from U2. Who knew that? Eh? In fact, I met Bono through the speaker.
I think everybody's a friend of Bono, but let me. I want to pursue a couple economic questions, but we're actually accumulating some questions from our listeners, and I don't want those to mount up. So let me ask you one of those now, and then we'll kind of go back and forth and include them. And here's a viewer question: how do you view the assertion by the Johnson government that technology in places such as between Norway and the Nordic countries could constitute a fix to the border situation between Ireland and Northern Ireland?
Well, I mean, we looked at that, and people visited the border between Sweden and Norway, and the view was formed at the time that it wouldn't work in Northern Ireland, because you would require some kind of fixed facilities in order to do this stuff, and the technology involved was unproven, and that it was kind of a lot of wishful thinking about it could be done. Of course, technology will be part of any solution that's found, because no doubt the checking of stuff coming across the Irish Sea from Britain to Northern Ireland, a lot of that will be done electronically, rather than physically looking at things. It'll be done by electronic means. But the view taken in Ireland and in the European Union was that these technologies wouldn't work and wouldn't do the trick in Ireland, because even between Norway and Sweden, there's still a requirement to have there are still physical border facilities, and there's still trucks are stopped and so on, and the problem is that between Norway and Sweden, that border is not a contentious border. It's not a contentious border. It's not a border that has any kind of history of sort of violent conflict. Whereas the one in Ireland does have. That border is a toxic political issue. Remains that way to this day, and also a lot of the border crossings between Norway and Sweden, I'm guessing, are probably in fairly remote areas. You're talking here about a part of Ireland. I mean, the border it's 300 miles long. It has about 250 roads of various kinds crossing the border. I mean, it's a different kind of border from the one that I think I know there is between Norway and Sweden. So bottom line is that we don't believe that those technical solutions would work in Ireland. If they would work, then we'd probably be happy to have them. But at the moment, we're not focused on that. We're focused on finding a way of implementing the agreement we reached last year. Remember, revisiting an agreement that was signed a year ago is not a normal thing to happen in international relations. I mean, I know you would say, well, the US revisited NAFTA and renegotiated. Yes, but NAFTA had been in place for what, 20 plus years?
25 years.
25 years. So I mean, and therefore it was maybe time to look at it again, maybe. But in the case of this is an agreement hasn't even come into force yet. So it was an agreement made last year. It didn't have technology as a solution. It had checks, light touch checks on the Irish Sea as a means of solving this conundrum of how you keep an open border on the island of Ireland, while at the same time Northern Ireland is part of the UK.
Well, do you think speaking of that, do you think that's just a negotiating tactic on Prime Minister Johnson's part, or do you think he's serious about actually doing that?
Je ne sais quoi. I don't know. I mean, it would be wrong of me to try and make judgments about Britain and its position and its tactics and so on. Who knows? But what I would say is that we have an agreement made a year ago by Prime Minister Johnson, who was in office at that time and has since gone through an election where that agreement was part of his pitch to the electorate and so on. It's not a matter for me, but I would say that you know, trying to revisit that agreement now in whatever way. I mean, this whole thing about technology and technology solutions, that's been around for 4 or 5 years, and it's shall we say, it is, I think they say in Scottish law, unproven. You know, it's an unproven idea, and to try and come back to that now, you know, weeks before we need to make a hard decision about on what basis Britain's going to leave the European Union, it seems to me to be counterproductive and not likely to be to lead us where we want to go, which is towards an agreement.
Let's go. I've got some more questions here, but let's go back to Heather for a moment.
Thanks, Bill. Actually, I'd like to pick up on the technology theme a little bit and talk about a growing transatlantic concern about data transfer and data protection. And Ireland is in the center of that conversation because so many of the U.S. tech platforms have headquarters in Ireland. And we've seen a lot of pressure transatlantic space, whether that's digital services tax, whether that's now the Ireland's Data Protection Commission having to weigh in. We really have a very thin, talk about skinny line because of the Schrems II decision that we can actually are able to transfer transatlantic data. So I just love from the Irish government's perspective, where we see technology companies looking to Ireland and expanding their base, but yet Ireland is sort of on the front lines of implementing the European Union's data protection and privacy policies, and you're getting caught in the middle. No, those are my terms, and you can push back on that. But I'd love your take on the digital agenda, which is so critical for the 21st century transatlantic economy.
We've got the 10 top, digital companies. You know, the Facebook, Amazon, and so on. Google. They all have significant operations in Ireland. A lot of them have their European headquarters in Dublin, and they really are a mainstay of our economy. So we have a lot of skin in this game. You know, this whole game of you know, and there are, let's be honest, there are issues, attitudes towards privacy and data differ from country to country, and they differ between Europeans and people in America. It so happens that under European law, the Irish Data Protection Commissioner regulates the companies that are headquartered have their European headquarters in Ireland. So a lot of these companies are headquartered in Ireland, and we've had to beef up our operations in that area very considerably. But we're happy to do it because it's part of our responsibility. So the Data Protection Commissioner has to regulate those companies for the whole of the European Union, and that's a big responsibility. And then, of course, you've had legal cases, Schrems, you mentioned, and you know, for example, essentially, the two arrangements that were made between the US and the EU have been struck down. You know, the Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield, they're both struck down, or both have been overtaken by judgments in the European Court. So our view is that this, you know, we can't just take our kids and go away and play on different fields, because we're on the same field. We're on the same playing field here, Europeans and Americans, and the data transfer between us is vital for both economies. So the only solution that commends itself to me, and I think to anyone else that has any sense in this, is that we need to have another go at reaching an agreement that can correspond to the needs of both Americans and Europeans, and that will be in line with the European judgments that have been made in recent times. So it's not a question of you know, the Irish Data Commissioner weighing in and spoiling the you know, the cake for everyone else. It's a question of having responsibility, but the prime responsibility rests with the negotiators on both sides to try and find a solution to this problem that enables this extraordinarily important flow of data to continue into the future, but with the concerns of both sides in relation to privacy looked after properly.
Let's go to another question from the audience. This one, Ambassador, is from a student, which is, how will recent developments affect Irish citizens obtaining degrees in the UK?
Well, not at all, actually, because they will be able to, obviously, every Irish person under the common travel area can move to Britain, can settle there, and if they qualify for a place at university, which many will do, because there'll be more places available in Britain from now on, because the European students' numbers may well be reduced because of the Britain's new status. But Irish people will still, as I understand it, will still be able to pay the same fees as British students. They won't be penalised by, they'll be under the common travel area. They'll be able to avail of the same fees as apply to British students. And indeed, British students coming to Ireland, will also benefit from our structure, our educational structure, where we have actually no university fees, or other than a relatively small, registration fee. So I don't believe there'll be very much change really in the educational relationship between our two countries. As I said to you earlier, I think there'll be a doubling down on our European commitment, and it may be that we will be encouraging more students to do their overseas studies somewhere like Germany or France or Netherlands or Belgium or wherever, because we want to have people for the future. It's important for our future to have people who are comfortable operating with fellow Europeans, and because we had this kind of comfort blanket always in the EU, that we had a big country which we're very close to, the UK, and that we were able to work together with on a lot of issues, and we saw eye to eye on a lot of things. That's gone now. So the need for us to hunker down with our continental partners has become much greater and much more important for us than it was, before the UK left.
I think you've addressed this. This is related, and you've kind of addressed it. So I'll just ask you if you have anything you want to add, which is another listener question. How will Brexit impact the ability of Irish citizens to live and work in the EU or in the UK? I think the answer for the EU is it's not going to have any impact at all.
No, and in fact, there'll be no effect on the UK either. No, our position will be totally unchanged. And in fact, what's happening now is that quite a number of British people are acquiring Irish passports, which they're entitled to, because a lot of them have an Irish grandparent born on the island of Ireland. So they're perfectly entitled to an Irish passport. And anyone who has any kind of desire to work abroad or work in the European Union is now getting an Irish passport if they're entitled to one. And therefore, the number of Irish passports being issued to people living in Britain has shot up over the last 4 years. When I was there, it was about 40,000 a year. Now I think it was at one stage 100,000 a year being issued to people in Britain. So, and actually British companies that have operations around the EU are telling their employees, if you've got an opportunity to get a passport from a European Union country, do it, because that'll be a valuable asset to you. But the one that's most likely, the country that the people are most likely to have a connection with, would be Ireland, because of the nature of the flow of people back and forth between Ireland and the UK over the last century or so.
Let me come back for a minute to the U.S.-UK deal for a second.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about I think the politics of it and sort of the macroeconomics of it, that it's good for prosperity, so it's good for all parties. Let's talk a little bit about whether there would be micro impacts. How would Ireland be affected if the UK and the US make how would Ireland be affected economically if the US and UK reach some kind of a free trade agreement?
I don't really see very many implications. I mean, I suppose it's possible that if there was a situation where under a free trade agreement between the US and the UK, certain products were tariff-free and there was still a tariff on products coming in from the European Union, maybe that would have an effect on Ireland's market share here. But given that 30% of our exports come to the US, and that most of those are pharmaceutical and medical devices exports, I'm not sure. And also, of course, if, say, for example, if Pfizer or one of the other major multinationals based in Ireland, if they suddenly found that a product they were selling into the United States was being sold more cheaply by or could be sold more cheap by their plant in Britain, they'll probably transfer, some of the production there in order to avoid the tariff. So So I don't really see too many problems in that area. But obviously, the best outcome would be if the European Union and the US could have a trade deal between them. And there's been some progress recently between the two sides. There's a small deal done there about a month ago, and the hope is that that might lead to further small deals. And from our point of view, the biggest thing would be if we could get rid of this dispute about Airbus and Boeing, because currently there are tariffs on Irish products because of subsidies given to Airbus, even though there's nothing to do with Airbus in Ireland. We have no activity whatsoever part of the Airbus consortium, and yet we suffered heavily from being to tariffs on some of our products, some of our key products. So we'd like that to be sorted out. And then, of course, there's now, the EU now has a right to impose tariffs on the US in retaliation for Boeing subsidies. And so this could get out of hand, or it could be resolved and dealt with, and that would reduce the quantity of tariffs being charged on transatlantic trade, which would be a very good thing as far as we're concerned. But I would like, we were very much in favor of the, what was it called? The TPP, wasn't it? Yeah, no, sorry.
TTIP.
TTIP, yeah, sorry, I've forgotten about it. There's so many of those.
TPP is another part of the world.
I know exactly, yeah. So we were strongly in favor of that because we believed that we would have been the biggest beneficiaries of that agreement. But of course, it ran into heavy weather and never made it past the
mostly heavy weather in Europe.
Exactly.
And it still has heavy weather in Europe.
I mean, not in Ireland actually, but I know I was living in Germany at the time, and I know that the resistance that was there, and the same was true in Britain. But ironically, a lot of the resistance came from Britain, by the way, because of fears that the National Health Service would be undermined. And yet, Britain is now looking to have a trade deal with the US, and that those issues will arise again. No doubt.
And you're hearing the same fear.
Yeah, the same fears will be there. Yeah, of course, yeah.
I should ask you the same question I asked the Swedish ambassador when we had a conversation, because their views on TTIP are similar, which is, why don't you have more influence with the Commission?
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's the Commission does the negotiating for us, and that's part of the way the European Union works. So that's where we have to go operate. But it doesn't always work, but it actually mainly works because if you had individual countries making deals, that would be more difficult, I guess. And the key thing about the EU is that we can use the collective muscle of the 450 million consumers we have to our advantage, and that's where Britain will find it maybe a little more challenging than they think, because they're now coming to the US with 60 million consumers instead of being part of a consortium of 500 million consumers. C'est la vie, as they say.
Heather, back to you.
Well, Ambassador, I just wanted to ask you two quick questions. I mean, what it seems to be the UK-EU talks have really been stuck on fisheries and level playing field state aid issues, and that comes in the form of both subsidies as well as regulatory standards. Is there an Irish fisheries issue that has strong domestic issues? I assume there is. I just would welcome your thoughts on that. We're certainly hearing from French fishermen that this is an incredibly important issue domestically, which it certainly has outsized role in the actual economic impact of that. And then the second question on the level playing field, is there a particular element, because of all the firms that are headquartered in Ireland, whether that's technology, sorry, that's the our dog is now entered into this webinar, I apologize, that in the subsidies, if there would be impact, particularly for companies that are headquartered in Ireland. Again, I apologize for our dog for making his appearance.
Sorry, there were two questions. I mean, the first one was what?
Fisheries.
Fisheries. Oh, yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, the irony about fisheries is that economically, it hardly registers on the Richter scale. I mean, it's like it's a tiny fraction of the GDP of most advanced countries. Let's be quite honest. But of course, in Maine, for example, here it would be a big deal. Lobster is a big deal. That's why that deal was done a few weeks ago between the EU and the US on which involved Maine lobster, because in Maine it's a big deal, and obviously in coastal communities around the European Union it's a big deal. Fisheries, and it's a motive. It's kind of, these are our waters, they're our fish. However, there is a solution to these problems, right? I mean, at the moment our waters are shared across the European Union. But they're subjected to quotas, so that, you know, someone could tell you how much fish EU countries other than Britain are allowed to fish in British waters. And it will be X tons. I don't know what it is, but it'll be a certain tonnage. And someone could tell you how much fish UK fishermen are allowed to fish in non-UK waters of the European Union. Much of that would be in Ireland, by the way, in Irish waters. And you take those two figures and you work on them and you massage them and you find a solution that, you know, British fishermen get more fish, get more of their own fish from their own waters, and European fishermen get more fish from our waters, but you still have a little bit of toing and froing, because after all, the fish are migratory. They don't realize that they're moving from European to British waters, and therefore that's why we have a common fisheries policy. And but the fish is politically emotional. I mean, for example, the one part of Ireland where European treaties are most often defeated would be in Donegal, which is where the Irish fishing industry is mainly located. And I remember every year when I was in Brussels going to the fish councils, which went on for 4 or 5 days, night-long sessions, wrangling about different quotas and total allowable catches and paper fish and imaginary fish and so on. And of course, horse mackerel. That was one of the big ones, horse mackerel. I'd never heard of a horse mackerel. I thought it was a whale of some kind. Anyway, so it's emotional, but I think it can be resolved. I think there's a kind of a numerical sort of, you know, little bit of mathematics, you know, you might do the trick. Unless countries take the absolutely, you know, fundamentalist position of, you know, I want everything. I want all my fish for myself, or I want all the fish I was getting before. If you're European, that won't work. But some kind of compromise can be made. On the state aid issue, obviously we appreciate the state aid regime because it protects us. Because we couldn't afford to subsidize companies in Ireland the way that France or Germany or bigger countries could do. So we think state aid is a good thing for the European Union. Now, sometimes the Commission takes it too far. For example, when a few years ago, they decided that Apple had received a state aid from Ireland in the form of being able to avail of our corporate tax regime. And they imposed a fine on Apple of 14 billion euros, about $16 billion. And the Irish government refused to take that money. They said Apple owed the Irish government $16 billion. We said, no, we don't want it because we don't believe it's our money. We don't believe it belongs to us. So we had a case that went through the European courts. And a few months ago, Ireland won that case and the Commission lost. Now the Commission are appealing, but I don't believe there's much scope for the appeal. So generally speaking, we regard state aid as a good thing. And the problem is that the British are now talking about giving state aid to British companies, and that will of course disrupt the level playing field in a big way. And the question will be, how do you have that kind of arrangement? How do you allow British companies to be subsidized by their government and still have free trade, full access to the European market as the British want? Now, I don't know how far the British want to go in this, because I mean, during the Thatcher era, for example, all that state aid was removed, and you know, companies were allowed to go to the wall because Britain realized it couldn't subsidize companies. I think this stage is more like picking winners, but even that's a very dubious strategy for a government. But it is a problem, and one of the problems that affects Ireland is that the question has arisen: well, what happens to a company in Britain that gets state aid but has a subsidiary in Northern Ireland? How is that company able to access the European single market while receiving a subsidy from the British state? Because remember, under the protocol, Northern Ireland will have full access to the European single market. It'll be the only place in the world that will have access to the UK market and the EU market. And the state aid issue is kind of leaking in to the Northern Ireland situation. Again, I think a pragmatic solution could be found, but I'm not a negotiator, so I'm not going to try and find it here.
We have two more questions, but I think probably only time for one of them because it may not be a short answer. In a post-Brexit world, how do you think the political gridlock that has been seen in Belfast will impact Northern Ireland's status within the UK?
Okay, well, that's a tough question, but I'll answer it. Look, I Brexit has had an effect on thinking in Northern Ireland, for sure, in that it has kind of brought the issue of United Ireland back into play. Now, it's not suggested that there is a majority for United Ireland at this stage in Northern Ireland, but certainly thinking has evolved. And I saw a recent poll which suggested that while there wasn't a majority for United Ireland, there also wasn't a majority for the status quo, in that there were people in between. So I think there was a plurality. I think the biggest percentage was for the status quo, slightly less than that for United Ireland, and then a big number of people who said they weren't sure, or they were likely, or they could be persuaded either way, but they were likely maybe leaning a little bit towards the status quo, but they were persuadable. And that's a big change from the way things were like even 20 years ago. So so things have evolved, but from our point of view, our government is not pushing for a referendum on United Ireland, and there are good reasons for that, because the view is that, and especially if you look back at the Brexit referendum has caused 5 years of turmoil in Britain, mainly because people, when they voted for Brexit, didn't quite understand fully what they were voting for. I mean, there was a simple notion: leave the EU, fine. But what does leave the EU mean? And we've discovered since that time that actually there are a whole range of versions of leaving the EU. You can leave the EU and have no relationship whatsoever with the EU, or you can be very close to the EU while not being a member. And no one seemed to have worked out in advance what version of Brexit the British public were going to be offered by their government. And we're determined that if and when there is a referendum, because there is a provision for one at some point, but only when there's evidence that there might be a majority in favor of United Ireland. But when that time comes, when that day comes, we want to make sure that the groundwork has been laid. And we've set up now in our Prime Minister's department a shared Ireland unit, which is basically going to start working on what it would mean, what a United Ireland would actually mean in practice. How you would deal with all the myriad of things that we're now dealing with in the EU-UK context over Brexit. But in Northern Ireland, you need to work those things out in advance so that people know exactly what they're voting for when they come to vote yes or no to United Ireland.
Well, we're over time. There's one more question, and I'm going to answer it and then ask the ambassador or Heather, if either one of you want to comment. The last question is about the possibility of reviving TTIP in a Biden administration. And I think my answer is unlikely, not because of Biden, but because of the EU. The statements coming out of the Commission from Sabina Van, the Director General, and I think also from the current Commissioner, is that now is not the time to embark on a comprehensive US-EU trade agreement. And I think if that's the attitude in Europe, I don't think that you're going to find people on the American side trying to change that in the short term. Do either of you disagree with that?
No, I mean, look, we would like it. We would think it would be great. And, let's be clear that new political configurations produce outcomes you don't maybe expect. So I'm not ruling out that there could be some kind of desire to come together and revive. It won't be called TTIP, it'll be called something else. But I don't rule it out. But I think more likely is that we'll start to try and do smaller deals. I mean, this last deal that was done is a very small, it's a micro deal, as you know. But there was an intention, I think, to try and have some further breakthroughs in that area, and then gradually build up and resolve, for example, the Airbus Boeing dispute, which would actually be a pretty significant win for both sides, really, because you have currently $2.5 billion worth of tariffs imposed on European products, and the EU could impose an equal quantity of tariffs on US exports to Europe. So potentially, if you solve that problem, you remove $5 billion in tariffs, which will certainly have a positive effect on trade between Europe and the United States. So I think probably more likely a kind of an incremental approach rather than the sort of big bang approach. But we would certainly be willing, if there was an opportunity, to see if there could be a big debate or a big negotiation, but a big deal. But I think smaller deals are more likely to be practical.
I agree,
enjoyed
Bill.
that.
I think it's unlikely. Look how difficult the EU is having with Mercosur and CETA, the Canadian trade agreement was very difficult. But I agree with the ambassador. Let's get some sectoral trade going. Let's start working on that regulatory harmonization. And can we stay away from agriculture just for a little bit so we can get a little momentum? Just maybe. Thank you guys both. It was a great conversation.
Thank you very much.
It's all about the chickens, Heather. You know, it's all about the chickens.
Plant that idea.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. This is
You're very welcome. I really enjoyed it immensely.
interesting,
Anytime you want to talk to me again, I'm available, okay?
happy to do it. And thank you all for listening. And with that, we'll close the session. Thank you.
Thank you.